Good afternoon and welcome to Washington Week's digital show, Washington Week Recommends. I'm Yamiche Alcindor. Each week, I recommend great reporting that I think deserves your attention. And today, I'll be speaking with Jake Tapper. Yes, that Jake Tapper. He's best known, of course, as being one of CNN's top anchors. But for the last 2.5 years, he's also been doing a bunch of other things, including investigating a possible wrongful conviction case that's personal to him and his father. And he wrote about it in the Atlantic's November cover story. The digital headline grabbed me. It says, quote, "How bad can a lawyer be?" Jake joins me now. Welcome to Washington Week Recommends. So, Jake, this is a moving piece. Break down the case of C.J. Rice, who was convicted at 17 years old. What went wrong here in the eyes of you and your father?
Well, thank you so much for having me, Yamiche, and thanks to everybody watching. So, my dad is a pediatrician. He's retired now. He's 82. But in 2011, he saw CJ. CJ had been a patient of his since CJ was born. He saw CJ, and CJ had been shot in a instance of what CJ says is mistaken identity. Whatever the reason, he had 3 bullets in him. He'd had them, one of them removed. He had another bullet that had fractured his pelvis. He had like 30 or so staples up and down his abdomen and chest, and he could barely walk. And he visited my dad in his office in South Philadelphia. And, you know, my dad told him to take Percocets, and CJ said he didn't want any. They made him feel weird. And that was it. He had been in surgery, he'd gotten pneumonia. He was just in bad shape. 5 days later, there was another shooting in South Philadelphia. And the police asked the people, the witnesses, the victims, who did it. They didn't know. They didn't know who shot them. It was 2 individuals. They said it was two black men wearing hoodies. And then a confidential informant told the police overnight that they had heard CJ was involved. The police, the detectives went back to the victims. Lo and behold, all of a sudden, one woman who had been asked 3 times the night before, and she didn't know who did it, all of a sudden she knew it was CJ, who she'd known for years because her son and CJ were friends. And what followed after that was just a travesty of justice. CJ went to turn himself in thinking this matter would be resolved because obviously he didn't do it, couldn't have done it. He figured the police would check his phone records to see that he was in West Philadelphia at the time of the shooting, not South. He is poor, and the court appointed an attorney named Sanjay Weaver. And everything after that was just a travesty of Sanjay Weaver's incompetence. She just did not have basic information about the case, did not poke the basic holes in the witness testimony, which was the only evidence against CJ, this one witness. And CJ is now doing 30 to 60 years in prison. My dad couldn't believe it, has been talking about this for years, has been trying to help CJ with his various appeals for years. But the system, as you know, Yamiche, is built around protecting itself. So when you go challenge the case and you say, like, I didn't have adequate representation, the person who decides that in Pennsylvania is the judge who presided over the case to begin with. In this case, a guy named Judge Cohen. And Judge Cohen just decided, no, of course it was a perfectly fair trial. I mean, why wouldn't he say that? He presided over it. And it's just been a shameful experience to witness, to watch, and to report about. We have a constitution that's supposed to ensure that everyone has the right to an attorney, but it doesn't mean it's a good attorney or even a competent attorney. And my dad is convinced CJ couldn't have done it, and I'm convinced he didn't have adequate representation, and this isn't justice.
And I want to read a bit of the article because you talk about sort of the same full legal system here. You write, quote, "Readers will draw their own conclusions about what happened on the night of September 25th, 2011. My father and I have drawn ours. There is certainly reasonable doubt, an excess of reasonable doubt, that Rice committed the crimes for which he was accused. What happened after the night is not open to argument. And you just broke it down. Rice lacked legal representation worthy of the name. As he discovered, the law provides little recourse for those undermined by their own attorney here." And I guess when we talked about the digital headline, one of the things that I wanted to point out was you asked the question, how bad can a lawyer be? In this case, what did this case tell you about how bad a lawyer can be?
A lawyer can be, and it's been found in cases, drunk. A lawyer can be asleep during the trial. A lawyer can be disbarred during the trial. A lawyer can have serious psychological and emotional problems, and courts have upheld that. The standard is so low, it's basically no standard at all. And in fact, this was what Thurgood Marshall objected to when this case was heard, about what constitutes adequate counsel. He said it's such a vague standard. There is no world in which I would have been charged with this crime. None. Based on one shaky witness statement? Never. But if I had, I would have been able to afford an attorney that would have gotten this case thrown out. The only reason that it's different, even if you take aside the racial parts of this, I'm white and CJ is black, and obviously there's a lot we could go into there. But more importantly, in a way, I have money and CJ doesn't. So I can afford an attorney worthy of the name. And CJ had a court-appointed attorney, which is different than a public defender. Public defenders are often quite good. They're often quite good at their jobs. Court-appointed attorneys are not. They have worse records. And that's what CJ had. He had an attorney who didn't even consult with my dad before his testimony, who didn't even ask for CJ's medical records to bring them as evidence, who didn't even discover that CJ had a fractured pelvis, who didn't challenge the witness. Wait a second, a night before, 3 different times, you said it wasn't CJ. You said it was, you didn't know who did it. Now you say you did. Who called as an alibi witness somebody who was not able to provide CJ with an alibi, so that looked shady to the jury, who did not have the actual alibi witness go to the police ahead of time and give his testimony. So when he did testify, the prosecutor was able to say, this is the first time we've ever heard from you, so this must be, he's suggesting that it was a lie. I mean, it was just complete incompetence. Anybody who watches 2 episodes of LA Law or Law and Order would have been able to provide better representation than this woman, who, sad to say, passed away in 2019. And there's reason to believe that she may have had some issues with her faculty in the last years of her life.
And I want to break down a little bit more about this case before I ask you about the differences between you and CJ and why you say that you would never have ever had the situation that he has now found himself in. You write about the fact that there were no guns were recovered, no physical evidence linked anyone to the crime. I wonder, when you think about sort of what you just said, that anyone watching a TV legal show would say this is not adequate defense. How in the world is CJ still in jail? How in the world is he still sitting there with all of what you just laid out?
Because a jury convicted him. And there is no, look, this is not a celebrated case. There's nobody has T-shirts. There's not, I mean, one of the reasons why, by the way, in addition to there being no DNA evidence, or there was no evidence. There was nothing you can't undermine his case because there was so little evidence against him to begin with. It was just this one woman's testimony and a bad defense. So I don't really understand it, but the system is built around protecting itself. So our legal system. People complain about journalism. They talk about how we get facts wrong and all that. But there is a system of accountability when it comes to the jobs we do. Because, first of all, we don't like to get things wrong. So if we get things wrong, generally speaking, ethical journalists apologize, correct the record, etc. But that does not exist in the legal system. There's no introspection. A judge in what's called to review the case, to say CJ didn't have adequate representation, it goes to the judge, as I told you. And Judge Cohen, of course, found that he didn't do anything wrong. Then it goes, and you can appeal that to more judges. Judges protect judges. That's what they do. There isn't really a way to take a look at miscarriages of justice like this one, unless there is overwhelming evidence of miscarriage of justice, such as DNA evidence proving that somebody got it wrong, or a crooked cop caught on tape. But there's none of that here, because that's extraordinary.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to point out something else as you break down the holes in our legal system. Your father, to me, this story is of course about CJ and what happened to him, but your father comes off to me as someone who I want to meet, someone who has this heart and this passion for really calling attention to this. And he tells you as a little kid, you say, we have a legal system, Jacob. We do not have a justice system. In reporting this story, what have you really learned about the realities about what your father was telling you all along, but also the role that you and your father and others like you can play in trying to push for that justice?
Well, my dad has always been a social justice warrior in the best sense of the term. And yeah, look, intellectually, I know that we don't have a fair court system, and that there are two systems of justice, one for people who can afford it and one for people who can't. That's not news to me. But once you see it, once you really absorb an instance of it where you see, here is this kid, his doctor, a man that I know, my dad, incapable of lying to a fault, says he couldn't have done it. He says he couldn't, like my dad's calling right now. He says he couldn't have done it. I believe my dad, but beyond that, the idea that every step of the way, there was no escape route for CJ. Yeah. He couldn't get a good lawyer. He couldn't appeal this. Nobody was looking out for him. And look, I have tremendous sympathy for the police in Philadelphia and the prosecutors in Philadelphia. They are trying to get hold of a horrible crime situation in Philly back in 2011 and also again today, without question. But my concern is the system is so built around cops making arrests and prosecutors getting convictions that sometimes the idea of justice might be lost. Are we 100% sure that this kid did this? I don't think people ask that. Although in the prosecutor memo that we got a hold of, it was very clear that the prosecutor knew that there were holes in the case, but he brought it anyway because he was told to.
Yeah. And that's a striking part, the idea that the prosecutor even now is saying, well, my higher ups, they were more senior. They told me to do this. I want to go to another part of the article where you say the reality is that Commonwealth v. Charles J. Rice represents nothing out of the ordinary. And you go on to say that even if reforms were enacted, they would scarcely hit at the dysfunction, the deep dysfunction in our system. So the question now is, what can happen? What should be happening?
Well, we need to make sure that people who cannot afford attorneys, that the promise of if you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you, that is a basic level of competence, that there, the system as it is in Pennsylvania, and I assume all over the country in different ways, it's not a system that guarantees good representation. You get something like $2,000 to represent somebody, win or lose, whether you spend an hour on the case or 100 hours on the case, $1,500 or something if you avoid trial. That's not a system that builds in any sort of incentives for somebody to provide a good defense. So, look, we need to provide, if we really believe that the Constitution stands for what it stands, and we need to provide adequate counsel for people who cannot afford it. Again, I would never have been charged with this. And if I had, the lawyer would have gotten it dismissed immediately. But CJ's doing 30 to 60 years in prison for a crime in which nobody was even seriously injured, much less killed. It's insane. There needs to be an actual investment in order for people to have the right to a competent attorney. The problem is that politically, that if you ever propose that, people accuse you of being soft on crime. And nobody supports criminals. Nobody supports violent people. We just have to, if we actually think that in this system people are innocent until proven guilty, we actually have to walk the walk. We have to make sure that we're actually providing them with adequate counsel. And look, I don't want guilty people free. I don't want people who commit acts of violence walking the streets. That's not what this is about. I have no sympathy for violent people. But I just think there is an excess of reasonable doubt about CJ. And even if you don't think that, anybody watching should think that he had the right to a competent attorney, a competent one. And in this country, that doesn't mean anything. And once you see it, and I know you know this, Yamiche, but once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Certainly, once you see it, you can't unsee it. And you said the Conviction Integrity Unit, that it's no longer considering his case. So what's next for him? What's going to happen now?
My understanding is that his lawyers are seizing on the attention his case is getting this week and filing a petition for a commutation for him today. And my understanding is that people in Harrisburg saw the story, saw me and my dad talking about it, and will take a look at the petition. And that's all I know, but that's more than we had a week ago.
It's more than you had. And one quickly, you talked about politics. What are the politics of this? Because you mentioned John Fetterman, you mentioned Josh Shapiro being part of the board. What role do you think you see of elected officials here?
Well, there's a parole board. There's a board of pardons. There's a whole bunch of ways that justice can happen here, with those boards at least looking at the case and deciding for themselves. So Attorney General Shapiro and Lieutenant Governor Fetterman, both of whom are running for office right now, so they might be a little busy. But my understanding is that both of them have seen the story, and they are on, I believe they're on the board of pardons. There's also Governor Wolf, Tom Wolf, a Democrat, who is the outgoing governor. And I know just from following Pennsylvania politics that, criminal justice issues are something he cares about. And he could commute the sentence, I think, tomorrow if he wanted to. So there are a number of ways where justice can be done. And all we're asking, really, people who have looked into this and CJ's actual legal advocates and my dad, all we're asking is just take a look at this. Tell me, do you think he got a fair trial? Tell me you think he had adequate representation? Because if you look at the record, this lawyer did not do even a basic job. I don't think she even visited the crime scene. At one point, the witness against CJ said that CJ, that she got a good look at him because he was about 20 feet away. But I went to the crime scene, and the place where CJ was allegedly standing, the place where the shooter was standing, whoever it was, is about 50 or 60 feet away. And remember, this took place at night. They were wearing hoodies. So there were so many opportunities to poke a hole in this woman's testimony. And look, I have sympathy for her. She got shot. I mean, her family got shot. Thankfully, nobody got seriously injured. But I feel bad for her. But I also know that my dad says there's no way CJ could have run, and this guy ran. My dad said he was hobbling around like a 100-year-old man.
Wow. Well, all critical reporting. I want to say thank you so much, Jake Chapper, for joining us, for writing this article, for sharing your reporting. And thank you all for watching Washington Week Recommends. You can find us every Friday here at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And be sure to tune in tonight to Washington Week on PBS. We'll discuss the January 6th committee's historic vote to subpoena former President Donald Trump and how it's playing out with voters across the midterms. Thank you so much. I'm Yamiche Alcindor. Good evening. See you this evening.